What we're doing today is taking the information that's been gleaned from 5 years of developing and delivering active shooter workshops for the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security has delivered hundreds of active shooter preparedness workshops to tens of thousands of workshop stakeholders. The goal here is that in the next 2 hours, you'll be prepared to begin developing your own active shooter preparedness plan. We're going to be talking about preventing an incident, stopping an incident before it occurs, the immediate actions you would need to take following an incident, immediate notification of everyone within your facility, and hopefully this type of event will never happen to your organization. But you need to be prepared. What are the immediate steps that you need to take following such an event? How would you notify everybody within your facility, your organization? What are the immediate protective actions that you need to be able and prepared to take? What we will not be doing today is sensationalizing these tragedies. We will not be sharing the names and pictures of the active shooters. What we will be sharing are the survivors, the responders, and what we can learn from the experts who have assisted communities in the recovery process. Many stakeholders ask, why should I invest the time and resources in developing this plan for something that probably will never happen? If I develop this plan, is it just going to sit in my desk for the next 10 years? We ask these same questions of law enforcement, emergency responders, and those responsible for helping organizations with resiliency.
When the situation arises and you haven't trained for it or prepared for it, you're mentally prepared for it, you're not going to know what to do. There's going to be this period of time where there'll be confusion, there'll be hesitancy on trying to decide what to do. By training, you eliminate that and you're able to respond a lot faster.
What organizations find when they invest in these processes that are driven by individual cases is that they find gaps within their organizations.
And I think a program that's done well will build on their capabilities because 80% of what goes into an emergency shooter plan is really a general emergency plan. It covers evacuation and all kinds of things that are applicable to just about any emergency.
There is some surprise of how much more powerful and effective we are as a we than as an I.
Things don't go as you plan in a real emergency. So the point of the drill is to not to scare people and not to try and make people fail, but to exercise capabilities to the extent that there are some things that don't go like you want them to. And then that information gets fed back into the planning process to allow you to develop improvements or alternatives and resolve that issue.
I would emphasize process over structure, right? Organizations are structured differently. They're geographically dispersed in different ways. They have different levels of resources, skills, and abilities. So I don't think there's any one structure that is ideal across organizations, but there are key considerations about the process. We want a process that builds communication.
And done well, there's always something you can do better. If you get 100% on an emergency exercise, you didn't plan the exercise well enough.
In the active shooter world, you only have seconds to make a fast decision, and it better be the right decision. And through training, you'll be able to make the best decision in order to save your life.
The process of planning is also valuable for any other emergency that your organization may face, whether it's a natural disaster or man-made emergency. It could be a fire response. It could be responding to an earthquake or tornado. That bonds the team in a way that may benefit your organization in other areas. Ultimately, we want to help you build not just a plan, but the capabilities that are necessary to respond and to recover from an active shooter incident. We also want to talk about preventing incidents, recognizing individuals who may be on the pathway to violence. What behaviors do they exhibit that we could recognize? What do you have for reporting mechanisms within your organization? And what capabilities do you have organizationally to intervene and provide appropriate support to these individuals? Most importantly, how can we help them without ostracizing them, creating an environment for them that's welcoming? We want to help you develop a process that is not prescriptive, that is tailored to your organization's needs. We'll also provide a recommendation for a plan template. The Federal Protective Service Occupant Emergency Plan is a very good example to follow. By the time we finish, you'll have the tools and the information necessary to develop your own active shooter emergency plan. The most important thing is that the plan that you develop will be tailored to your facility.
A recent study by the Federal Bureau of Investigation indicated there have been approximately 160 active shooter attacks in the United States in the period between 2000 and 2013. The study found that about 70% of those attacks occurred at a business, mall, or place of education, and identified what appears to be a rising trend in active shooter violence.
We've been looking at hundreds of events since 1966, and as these events have occurred, we've noticed active shooters or the attackers adapt their tactics. We've seen in Columbine where the two attackers utilized explosive devices combined with weapons. We've also seen attackers, in the case of the Aurora Theater shooting, we saw the attacker donning ballistic gear. One thing that we can note is that these attackers learn from past events. Law enforcement is doing the same. From Columbine, law enforcement changed tactics as far as entering in buildings. That was a catalytic moment for law enforcement. Organizations themselves are learning. Virginia Tech, one of the big issues during that attack was the door designs, and in particular within the classrooms of the Norris Hall. Those classrooms couldn't be locked from within. The students could not lock themselves from the attacker coming in from the hall, so they adapted to that. The Discovery Building, after their hostage situation, they'd limited access to the building, locked off doors, additional cameras. Look what has gone on in the past and learn from that. Make that part of your preparation and your planning process. No two attacks are alike. These attacks are case by case. There's no way for an organization to plan for every contingency and every attack. So it's vital from when you're putting these plans together to have flexibility, and also training that flexibility into your people within your organization to when there is something that occurs, or if it does occur, that they know they have options and what options to choose from. It's not just one plan that fits all. And it's vital for when you do prepare your plan and you have a plan in place that you practice it. You practice like you play.
The first step in developing your plan is to identify the planning team. Experts suggest the team should not be smaller than 4 persons and not unmanageable, not more than 10 persons. So how do you fill those spots? Who needs to be on the team? How do you develop a robust, inclusive planning team? As you'll see, it's important to get a broad perspective.
If the group is too small, there tends not to be that diversity of awareness of developing concerns, that diversity of skills and abilities, and diversity in terms of connections with subsets of our organization or our community.
The functional part of it is you need to have HR. Part of it is labor laws. If you're a non-union workplace, if you're a union workplace, you'll have contracts that even overlay the labor laws. And you have to be able to take into account what you're going to ask people to do, when you're going to ask them to do it in the exercises and that sort of thing. You have to fit that into the constraints of that environment. And then certainly the default is always the security and protective people that have the concern for day-to-day operations. And finally, the other element that makes a huge difference is engineering. Engineering and IT know more about the physical location of the workplace than any other groups. So having those two involved in the plan can provide some options that you just wouldn't come up with if you didn't have them there.
All of that to foster a collaborative approach to the safety and the well-being of the organization. That safety and well-being is no longer solely the purview of HR or security or management. Again, it's that shared responsibility. And so we're going to collaborate and we're going to coordinate our efforts. So this is a very different way of working than what many hierarchical organizations have developed over time, when segments of the organization are responsible for segments of the duties. And now this is a more collaborative process.
The other really critical people to have sometimes are surprising to our participants, but I emphasize that you've got to have the corporate legal staff, a representative of the lawyers, and risk managers. Risk managers are valuable because they understand the plus side of this, what the benefit is, insurance costs reduced, liability reduced, and then lawyers can eliminate a lot of concerns and questions early on that will certainly come up at some point in the process.
Now we're going to add in other considerations for building a multidisciplinary process. Who helps us do a couple of key things to support communication, coordination, and collaboration? Who is in a position that is likely to have diverse sources of knowledge about developing threats or concerns. Security likely has different awareness of developing concerns than does HR, than does management, than does EAP, than does mid-level managers, as one example. So what's the right pick from across the organization based on those roles to build our awareness as broad and diverse as is possible given the resources?
Every organization is different. Not every organization will have a legal staff, will have a robust HR department, but it's important that you have these issues that are covered with the individuals that are within your organization. The goal is to identify those with different perspectives and to draw from those that will be able to provide the necessary pieces of your puzzle. Later on, we'll talk about incorporating law enforcement officers to augment and expand your planning team. As your team begins to collaborate and begins the planning process, you will likely find the value is almost immediate.
For instance, what can you do to assist those who may not be able to run, hide, or fight? Ty Williams played football for the Georgetown Hoyas before a traumatic spinal injury ended his career. We sat with Ty to discuss his injury and what he would do if confronted by an active shooter.
I was on the field for 30 minutes. The ambulance came, I went. They told me I needed surgery, and then the surgery is supposed to take 6 hours. It took an additional 9 because I had a massive hematoma on top of my spinal cord, which could have burst. I've gotten used to it. It's just it's my new normal for right now. But I mean, there's plenty of things here and there that just maybe I need just a tiny bit of assistance. I mean, run. I mean, I can push my chair. Somebody can push my chair. The hide thing. I mean, it's not exactly easy to hide something as big as a wheelchair, especially in my situation where I don't have one that folds up or anything. And then fight. I mean, I'm not saying I'm helpless, but at the end of the day, if someone has a gun or a knife or something, you know, I kind of stand out anyways. It's kind of hard for me to approach them in any kind of stealthily or timely manner in the first place. So if I'm poised in that situation, or if I'm in a situation where like I have to fight, I mean, you know, I'm going to put up the best I can. And obviously, I wouldn't say I'm at a disadvantage. I mean, I do know how to still protect myself, and you know, I've learned that, how to protect myself in my new way. But it's a lot more difficult to run, hide, and fight when you've got a 40-pound chair or something like that. I believe it's important that people know how to help. What we've learned is called the two-man lift, which is somebody can lift me up, but like under my legs and under my armpits. And there's a certain way to do that, but it's important that people know how to do that. Because, I mean, I've been through it myself, just trying to talk to my friends through it, and sometimes, and they're just very cautious because they kind of think like you're fragile and whatnot because you're in a chair, so they're kind of very hesitant about things. And then another big thing is, even if you don't know we haven't gotten across a way to do that type of thing, just talk to the person, talk to them calmly. And like the number one thing I would say, just don't grab some person's chair. Don't just start pushing them somewhere, because trust me, that is very uncomfortable and it's not enjoyable. And I get you're trying to help, and I'm sure they would get it too, but that quick, it's important the same way if you're mobile or if you're handicapped to process a situation and not panic immediately.
By developing this plan and sharing the personal protective actions with your employees, you'll be protecting the lives of your most valuable resources. In addition, having a plan mitigates your risk and lowers your organization's liability.
An analysis of over 400 active shooter events revealed that 1 in 4 of those cases resulted in a civil suit. This ratio increased when we looked at schools, private businesses, and public facilities. 2/3 then of all those civil suits cited negligence on the facility's behalf for either failing to provide adequate security or for a facility manager failing to act upon information they had received about an individual posing a potential threat.
Every organization needs a plan. Even police departments need an active shooter response plan for their own facility. Some even need to meet compliance standards, including providing a safe workspace under the OSHA General Duty Clause. Planning isn't easy, and it does take time, but it's important and it will save lives.
The time to try and figure out exactly what it is that you should be doing in that type of situation isn't when it's happening. It's well before. It should be well thought out.
So as we improve communication, as we improve collaboration, as we improve coordination, we build stronger organizations, we build stronger communities, particularly if we're doing that within the context of building the safety and the well-being of the organization or the community. If we're building the safety and the well-being of the organization, we're making us better. We are doing that with each other, for each other, not just to each other. That's an important distinction. So organizations commonly find that these multidisciplinary processes help make them stronger organizations. They begin to apply those same methodologies to other complex problem solvings that might be around manufacturing, distribution, sales, marketing, but they learn that the same concepts can help improve the strength and the capabilities of their organization.
The fact that someone is willing to take their time, the organization has invested in creating this quick response team, we'll call it, also sends a message, albeit informally, that workers matter. We're not going to just throw you under the bus. We have support for you.
Now that can be done in a lot of different ways. I think that it's an error to solely do that through our policy or through online training mechanisms, through more passive training and awareness.
The notion that people are not alone and the notion that we are providing interpersonal support is a huge step. In a way, we're talking about immunity, a form of resistance. If we put it in the medical metaphor of immunity, it actually gives us some insight into what might be going on and how we can better prepare. So immunity is thought of from the medical point of view as developing antibodies. And to develop antibodies, you have to first be exposed to a low-level pathogen. In the psychological world, we call the pathogens stressors. So can we develop a sense of psychological immunity, what's sometimes been called psychological body armor? And the answer is very clearly yes. The best way to do that, however, is to anticipate as best you can the nature of the critical incidents, the traumas, the disasters that you might be confronted with. So when we think about developing psychological immunity or psychological body armor, the single most important thing we can do is to prepare. Set realistic expectations of worst-case scenarios. For example, in the context of a bank, what is the stressor that bank employees are most likely to encounter? Well, you think of the most extreme, it's probably going to be a holdup, a robbery. That's where most training officers stop. I want to train someone who can not only effectively manage the situations that we've anticipated, I want to teach them how to manage the situations that you've never seen before. And that is, to me, the ultimate level of training, being able to take control of a situation and manage a situation you've never been in before. We know how to do that, but it takes a far greater investment of time and energy. But even though you get a flu shot, it doesn't mean you can't get the flu. But if you've gotten a flu shot, chances are, even if you get the flu, the course or trajectory of the flu will be less severe. And that's the bouncing back part.
A good plan takes into account not just employees, but your customers, shoppers, patrons, students, and others. Unfortunately, as we saw with the 2007 Virginia Tech shooting, the stakeholders were not prepared, and they faced the worst-case scenario.
It started like any other day. I was a sophomore in college at Virginia Tech. I jumped out of bed, I got dressed. We sped to campus and we did talk about skipping class that day because we were already running pretty late. You know, it's awkward to be late when you walk into a small classroom. Our teacher would intentionally kind of move us around so we get to meet other colleagues and people in the class for the morning's activity. Well, because we were late, we missed that portion. So while everyone else is really not sitting in their usual seats with their book bags and everything, the day has begun, we're just kind of disruptingly showing up. And she was very nice about our being late, handed us our assignments. We just quickly sat down, and it was right after that, basically, that we heard the first gunshots. The closest thing I could relate it to was like an axe being taken to a piece of wood. It felt like a very quick, sharp chop, 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 chop. And my teacher was at the front of the class, and I mean, it went from normal chatter to just complete silence and kind of the sense of urgency of something is wrong, but no one really knew what. And as she appeared in the hallway, I mean, she probably saw him, but when she came back in, she said, "Call 911." The last thing I ever seen before I looked away was two students in front of my class, Matt and Henry. I remember seeing their arms extend, and I think what they were trying to do most likely was help her get their desk to the door to block it. But literally as they pushed, he walked in. So he shot them first, went to the other side of the classroom, and took an active shooter stance there and started shooting. And so as he got there, I mean, it was very, very quick. It was probably, looking back, 5-7 seconds between acknowledging there's some noise out here to them being physically in our classroom. That's one of the scariest things about this, is that for those 12 minutes, however long of those minutes he was in my classroom, because we were so unaware and unprepared, he had full control of what happened. There was a lot of discussion about our perpetrator before the shooting. He was on the faculty's radar, he was on the care team's radar, he was a little bit on law enforcement's radar, he was on his roommate's radar, but they were not communicating together in that way. And so I think that has definitely changed coming out of this event.
Several individuals had knowledge of pieces of the puzzle, but there wasn't a mechanism, there wasn't a structure, there wasn't an authorized capacity for one entity to be able to be the centralized clearinghouse, if you will, for those data points.
There was a lot of information out there about Chuck. I believe that there was information in the ether that if Cho, once he was deemed to be a threat, maybe to himself, maybe to others, if that information were looked at from one place, all that information were looked at from one place, I think he might have been identified.
There were potential opportunities that were not capitalized on. And so the institution was quick to see how can we do that more effectively. Of course, being mindful of relevant laws and professional ethics would come into play about sharing of information.
So Dr. Gene Dysinger was brought in to lead the organization, and so now Virginia, Connecticut, Illinois have to have threat teams in practice, which I think is one of the best comprehensively proactive things you can do, because it's addressing that this is an ongoing issue, regardless.
The threat management process was new to the campus. While pieces of it had been in place for a long time, as a structure itself, it was new. One of the things that was one of my first initiatives was increasing the public awareness of that process and outreach and engagement with the community about the perceived barriers to using that process, fears about what it meant to use the process. Would students that we had minor concerns, thought they needed to be followed up, but would they end up on a watch list and be persecuted? That was a fair concern. It wasn't happening to my knowledge, but it was an understandable concern. And so I felt it important to meet those people where they were at with their fears and perceptions, try to address those, and build relationships with them.
So far, we've learned how to bring together the team that will be necessary to begin developing an emergency plan. We've discussed incorporating a wide range of voices across your organization and seeking out new perspectives that may yield key breakthroughs. Increasing communication and having an effective plan in place that is tailored to your facility enables your organization to prepare itself for action. In this next section, we'll learn to identify emerging threats before they manifest. What are the behavioral indicators, the appropriate intervention mechanisms, and risk assessment steps necessary to mitigate these challenges prior to any loss of life?
What we found in the after-action reports of the Virginia Tech shooting was that many people had pieces of the puzzle, but they didn't have a process to put the pieces together. In addition, there were communication issues, such as notification problems and calls being routed to 911. In the end, it was the student with a grievance that many departments were aware of. How can we anticipate this and build a plan to detect this before an event occurs?
The pathway to violence, in a simplified form of that, is 4 major components to it. The first is the ideation, or the thought about using violence to address a perceived or real grievance or provocation. High base rate behavior, most of us have those reactions. Few of us actually act on it. What we're looking for in addition to that grievance is the unresolved or unresolvable grievance that the person won't let go of and engages in behaviors to take harmful actions in response to that grievance. Oftentimes the people that come to our attention are referred to as injustice collectors. It's not just one grievance, it may be a series of grievances over time. We're really looking at the person or the groups that beyond the grievance pile on all of these other behaviors, responses, and narrow the field of options where violence or significant disruption is the only path that's left. The next step in the evolution of the risk is a planful approach. So engaging in planning around it. Not just I'm mad at the boss, I feel betrayed by my coworkers, but they need to pay for it, and now how? So I start thinking, do I want to embarrass or shame them? Do I want to cause physical damage? Do I want to sabotage IT systems? Do I want to use physical violence, etc.? We're still all at the internal psychological processing of that, but it's now more likely that pieces of that are being shared with others, both initial fantasy or ideation about it, and now some aspects of the planning. When they move into that next phase, which I would refer to as the acquisition phase, it's acquisition of the means, the method, the opportunity, and the proximity to the identified target or targets. That's when our concern increases significantly. The means are the tools or the capabilities that are needed to implement the plan. Those could be weapons, that could be certain clothing types, it could be other tools that are necessary. The opportunity is about timing, largely. When, and here there might be symbolic references. It might be an anniversary of a relationship if it was fueled by domestic violence. It might be the anniversary of a separation. It may be when another high profile act, so we'd have a contagion effect coming into this. And then lastly, it's proximity. Most deployments of targeted violence are highly personal in nature. Even if there's no relationship with the actual targets, it's a very personally felt grievance or provocation that may have been generalized onto others, but that means that the individual is going to be in relatively close proximity when they engage in the damage, in most cases. And then the next step would be probing and breaching and surveillance, which may feed back into both the ideation, the planning, and the acquisition. So there is a feedback loop there as well. The good news is that most people that engage themselves even in the planning phase stop at that point and don't move forward with it. It resolves the concern. They realize there are too many barriers, too many inhibitors to moving forward with the plan, and they stop. We're really looking at the person or the groups that beyond the grievance pile on all of these other behaviors, responses, and narrow the field of options where violence or significant disruption is the only path that's left. For those that do, then the next stage is the implementation when all of the pieces come together.
What the pathway to violence shows us is the steps that an individual may take in developing a plan and implementing an incident such as this. It takes time. And there are opportunities to recognize the behaviors that they may be exhibiting to intervene. The question then is, whose responsibility is it to monitor these behaviors? What policies do you need to empower your team? When do you need to intervene? And who within your organization is trained and capable of appropriate intervention?
So the research in resilience says the single most powerful factor predicting resilience is the support of other people, interpersonal cohesion and support. And that's what we must do. I mean, that is our strategy.
If we've learned anything about complex targeted violence, is that no one discipline, no one entity has all the information or all the answers about how to address it. So we want to pull together security, human resources, mental health, whatever the different facets of the organization are that help us build awareness of developing threats and bring tools and resources to manage and mitigate those threats. One of the most important things about a threat management process is our ability to monitor a situation and then adjust our case management plan as the situation continues to evolve. So it's a longitudinal focus.
And if you talk to many first-line supervisors, who are trusted, by the way, they will tell you that employees come to them not only with work-related problems, they come with personal problems. And personal problems often spill over into work and become work-related problems.
I never left an outreach program in a community setting without a new case. Invariably, somebody would come up and would say, Gene, what you were just describing is very much like somebody I work with, a class that I teach, somebody that used to work here and isn't here anymore, but still scares the devil out of me. Is that the sort of situation you want us to bring to you? To which my response was always yes. Because even if that situation turned out not to merit, not to need the resources of the threat assessment team, it was an opportunity to bond with a community member, to collaborate with them, and to build an information source for the next concern. But if we have an early identification and early intervention process, as we develop awareness of some of those early markers and intervene and problem solve with those before the individual really gets restricted down to violence being the only pathway left to them, we've actually got a lot more tools to use to address the situation, and many more to use that are not punitive or adversarial in nature. So what the community will experience is that the concerns are brought forward collaboratively and with the spirit of building the safety and the well-being of the organization, and that's the outcome. People whose behavior is so egregious they need to be held accountable are held accountable. But those that are dealt with adaptively by the organization and proactively, people, when they see that as a regular outcome of a process, that's what builds the trust.
So we think one of the best strategies you can do is a simple investment in not only teaching managers how to manage from the organizational point of view, but how to manage people. And part of that, the missing link, has been dealing with psychological perturbations, crises.
What we just heard from the experts reinforces what we've heard as we've gone around the country. By providing employee assistance to those individuals that need help, often it diffuses the situation just by having someone for them to speak with and someone who expresses concern for their situation. What you want to create is an open door policy where people are comfortable in reporting and know that the concerns they express will be followed up on. Conversely, it's also important to make sure that those that report are protected. Many employees don't want to be perceived as rats. They don't want to get others in trouble, and they don't want to get themselves in trouble. What we found, rather than getting people in trouble, is these policies create the engagement that Dr. Deisinger refers to.
What we're asking people to do is to share observations about relatively small subsets of behavior, because we've learned from experience that it's unlikely that any one person will be in a position to know everything about a circumstance. So what that means is that we're asking people to share information about things that will not in fact turn out to be highly problematic. And we need for people to know that that's okay and is not going to result in adverse actions that aren't merited.
The people that are most likely to recognize that are the people who are the most tuned in to what normal behavior is for that area.
This is key here. So beyond physical security, it's up to each individual employee, no matter how important you are to the company or to the workplace, you have to be an active participant in your own security. You can't just rely on guards, law enforcement, first responders. You have to be an active participant.
We want to build engagement, people's shared sense of responsibility to each other for the safety and the well-being of the organization.
What builds trust? When people can come to that manager under bad conditions, trust them enough to say some things that may be embarrassing, and that manager supports that person psychologically as well as professionally.
Now, one of the things that's incumbent upon an organization is to build awareness of the processes that are in place. Nobody can report or get involved if they don't know where to do that or how to do that. And they're unlikely to have read a policy. They may not find it on a website. So there's got to be an active effort from the organization to make that information available to members of its community as often as possible. Now, the mistake that gets made is the assumption that none of these people will respond to reasonable attempts to reach out. Some of them will not, I've learned from experience and just common sense. What I was actually surprised by as I got into this was how many of them were hungry for that engagement, to be understood, to be heard, to have another opportunity to feel part. Now, we've got the best opportunity of facilitating that the earlier that we identify that level of marginalization, separation, grievance, whatever is driving that difference.
The ultimate test of being a good manager of a person is, can you manage that person when they're in crisis?
Marginalization fuels a variety of other things, including not taking advantage of resources, resources not being extended out because the person is on the margins, etc. So the more that we can build community, the more that we can provide opportunities, and by we, I don't mean the organization as the structure, as the management, I mean by all of its members, that we build a sense of collegiality, of community, of inviting involvement, we will decrease the risk for that marginalization and then that small subset of marginalized individuals who turn to violence as a means of addressing that marginalization and the other related grievances.
The purpose of any preparedness and response plan is to identify and mitigate risks before they manifest. Still, physical security remains an important last line of defense for any facility.
So you look at that from the outside looking in. You look at barriers, you look at the way your parking lot's set up, your entrance, your exit into your property. Then you start taking into consideration, do you have security guards, do you have cameras? What do you have that's going to prohibit an active shooter from entering your building and getting to your key resources, which are your guests and which are your personnel and the employees of your organization? While you're building these barriers, while you're building these concentric circles of security, what are you looking at as far as first responders and law enforcement, firefighters, paramedics, EMS being able to get into your building, neutralize an active shooter, and to assist and help the injured people that are on your property? You take into all aspects of physical security, but look at it through a lens of an active shooter and look at it through the lens of a first responder. You look at the vulnerabilities, you look at the risks you have, and you take those into consideration when you're developing your plan, specifically in terms of an active shooter response plan.
One of the things we recommend in terms of evaluating your physical security is that there are a number of resources that are available to your organization at no charge. One is the Homeland Security Protective Security Advisor Program, where they will come to your organization. They will do a walkthrough of your facilities, entirely no obligation. The information just stays between you and the PSA. Also, a lot of police departments, law enforcement agencies around the country have officers that are highly trained in something called crime prevention through environmental design. And they are also trained to come to your facility and do a complete evaluation. And it's something that also is done free of charge. So a combination of these may be very beneficial to evaluate your physical security posture and to get recommendations on what may be effective. We also recommend that you look at your entire facility from the standpoint of an active shooter incident and also from the standpoint of law enforcement that has to get into your facility in response to an incident such as this.
In the fall of 2010, Chris Wood and several of his co-workers were taken hostage in the lobby of the Discovery Channel building in Silver Spring, Maryland. We sat down with Chris Wood to discuss the event and how physical security at the facility changed in the months following the attack.
I think they immediately began changing their response, and they began talking about if there is a hostage situation, a gunman, violence in the workplace. They began putting that together. They put together a video that was talking about what to do in certain situations, about locking yourselves in interior doors, paying attention to email, communicating with your upper level management, checking in with people. And so some of the things they were already doing, but I think some of the things that they had not communicated before. Before there was just a receptionist and the security guard kind of stood around, as where now there is a security guard, typically an off-duty police officer, and a panic button somewhere in there. And so I think having all three of those things, especially if you're in a high-profile industry, it's a lot cheaper to hire an off-duty police officer and putting those security measures in place than actually having something happen. You never know what's going to happen. What I also didn't realize, which I later found out, was that every room is cameraed, which you expect in a corporation, but it is also mic'd, so they could hear everything that was going on inside. They also had 24-hour security surveillance on all the cameras. And so as far as knowing exactly what was happening immediately, they knew immediately what was going on and were able to begin communicating with employees. There was 3 major entry points into the building. Sometimes there'd be guards standing outside the less descript doors and just checking badges before you actually scan them in. There, at that point in time, could have been more security, but I'm not so sure that they needed it. Since then, they've now installed stalls that you have to go through. Well, you can't even get into the building if you're a visitor. The furthest you can get is into a vestibule, and you can't get into the main lobby. So, unfortunately, like most situations, the changes that are necessary were not made until afterwards. But I think as far as security procedures to make sure there was some cushion before you actually got into the heart of the building, that was there.
But what happens when a gunman attacks in an open environment? We spoke with survivors of the 2011 shooting in Tucson, Arizona, which had targeted Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords.
The day began, I always tell the story starting the day before. I had been a page for Gabrielle Giffords in the summer of 2010, and I didn't get a photo with her while I was in DC. And so for me, that was a really important thing. And we heard about this event that was happening really close, just around the corner from our house.
We as a family left early in order to arrive at 10 o'clock on the dot at the Safeway.
We woke up and we piled into my mom's van and we drove to the Safeway and we got in line.
Doris was number 2 on the list. I was number 3 on the list.
Daniel Hernandez was signing people in. So I signed in. I asked him, "Are you going to take people in order?" And he said, "Yes." So I went in the grocery store and putzed around in there, seeing what was on sale from the holidays, and then came back out and there's 20 people. And I asked Daniel, "Are you still going to take people as they signed in?" And he hesitantly said, I'll try. And I said, "No, I'll just go to the end of the line. I'll be fine." And I believe that that may have saved me from being injured or saved my life, because I was the last person in line. There was nobody behind me.
I started talking to her. We finished with that, then we were talking about some other issues.
Suddenly I heard a bang, and I've never shot a gun, but I knew it was a gun.
And I tasted gunpowder.
And then my memory gets really hazy. I don't really remember. I remember standing up from having crouched down and seeing blood everywhere.
Shot Giffords, then shot me, and then he turned and shot them. So there's about like a little over 4 seconds. There were 12 shots.
I had a thought that if I ran to the west into the parking lot, or if I ran to the north towards Walgreen, that I might make myself a target. So I decided in a split second that my best chance was to lay down on the sidewalk and hope that I wouldn't be noticed.
I have no conscious memory of any thought, but I took my daughter and I bodily threw her against the concrete wall and I covered her with my body. Emma was curled up, trying to curl tighter underneath me, and her head was right here under my arm, and he tried to shoot her head through my arm. So it creased my arm and it blew all this concrete into my arm, and I got very angry. So this is the first time I can say I just thought, little man, you better have the cojones to be looking me in the eye if you're going to shoot me again. And I turned around to look at him. And he was only 2 feet behind me. And he dropped his gun from my head to my back and shot me the 3rd time.
All of that happened in a matter of less than 20 seconds, 33 rounds in less than 20 seconds.
He had clearly not been counting because he pulled the trigger and there were no bullets left. So we all heard the snick click of the magazine release and the clatter as that magazine hit the concrete.
Bill Badger and Roger Salzgaber came in after the shooter. They chased him and knocked him to the ground. They had him pinned, they yelled, "Get the gun, get the magazine." Well, they had him pinned on the right side. So his arm with the gun was too far from me. I noticed that he was taking another magazine out of his pocket with his left hand.
She just reached over and grabbed the new magazine the fresh magazine he was trying to put into the gun.
And I was able to take that away from him. Then in another matter of seconds, I noticed that he was flailing his legs. And again, my mind said, what happens if he gets up? And so I put one knee on each of his ankles.
He had been pinned down 3 feet away from me. I had stepped over his body while I was making a phone call, while I was on the phone with 911.
Fortunately, people were coming out. There's a doctor and his wife were shopping inside Safeway. They came out and started triaging.
And I could just see people dying, people taking their last breaths. And from Safeway runs what looked like the entire butcher's department with armfuls of white. The white cloths that they use for uniforms, and they were giving it to people and helping them hold it.
There were people inside the Walgreens right next door who came out and started bringing out stuff from the store to help people.
And that's how we all stayed until the Pima County deputies arrived. We were shocked that they didn't get there sooner, because there's one fire station with EMT a mile to the north and another one a mile to the east, and nobody was coming. It felt like forever. It was probably 15 minutes.
Then suddenly all hell broke loose as all of the first responders came. And all I could think of is that I wanted my children out of there. It's a lot to ask a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old to witness and sit with.
People say, I can't believe it happened on the corner of Ino and Oracle in Tucson, Arizona. Perfect example. Can happen anywhere. I know some people realize that, but there's a lot of people who need to know that these are real people with real families. A little 9-year-old girl that went to see her congresswoman dead on the sidewalk. It makes me very appreciative of the actions of others, Bill and Roger, the law enforcement, the Nancy Bowman and David Bowman and the other 2 doctors that were there. All I have to do is think about how fortunate I am. I'm a person of action. I did take an action. But Bill and Roger, they were the ones that had the courage and the foresight and the action to do that. I think my act, although it may have been significant, does not hold a candle to Bill and Roger's.
What we've heard now reinforces the actions that individuals and organizations can take to mitigate active shooter risks. We've learned how to institute policies that may diffuse emerging threats by identifying individuals in crisis and assisting them through that period so as to prevent them from traveling along the pathway to violence. The next step is learning more about how to respond to the worst-case scenario. What can you and your organization do to help yourself and others survive an active shooter event?
The actions of Pat Maish and others raises interesting questions. Who are the first responders? What is response? When faced with a life-threatening emergency, what actions should individuals take? How should you coordinate with law enforcement? What are the actions that are necessary from your organization, and what resources are required to implement these immediate actions? At the individual level, the Department of Homeland Security endorses the Run, Hide, Fight training. As we saw in the Tucson incident, anybody is capable of making a difference. The individuals protected others, engaged the gunman, provided immediate first aid. The civilians were the first responders.
So that first lady that they extracted from the room, pulled her out where she was in her office with her boss. The suspect had walked up, put the shotgun to her head, pulled the trigger, the gun didn't go off, racked it, pulled the trigger again, and then walked away. So she's had 2 muzzles in her face and she's had a bad day. So I had asked her, I said, well, later on I got to meet her. I said, well, why didn't you try to tie him up or fight? She said, well, nobody told me I could fight. We've never had the run, hide, fight training. I didn't know what to do. We were always told to just go hide somewhere. So that pissed me off.
When we made entry to the actual mall itself, all the gates were down, and that eerie mall music that you just kind of tune out normally was playing, just like it was on our training nights. There was no people running around. There was no screaming and yelling. Everybody was absolutely quiet. It was an eerie quiet, and the employees sheltered in place with their patrons until we made contact with them and were able to evacuate them. There was nothing that we could have done that day as a team to really prevent the loss of life. He had ended his own life prior to our arrival. What saved lives that day was the employees of the Columbia Mall, the patrons of Columbia Mall, and their preparations prior to the event that actually saved lives. The other thing the mall did, they trained their employees in response to an active shooter or an active assailant situation. They knew that they had to get out of the area, either hide or fight. So run, hide, or fight. Those are the three things that they taught their employees at the Columbia Mall. What they did was, during that day, is when the shooting began, they grabbed patrons that were out in the hallways, drugged them into their stores, shut their gates, and hid in the back storerooms of those stores. So they essentially took away all of his targets. So by the time he had fired his sixth shot and had to reload, he had no more targets to engage. He turned around, he saw a mannequin in a store window. He engaged the store mannequin thinking it was a person because he didn't have any other people to shoot at. That was all to the benefit of the employees of the Columbia Mall and their preparation prior to this event. I'm a firm believer in the Run, Hide, Fight video. I think it's an excellent resource for businesses. It's on YouTube, easy to find if you type that in, and it provides them an idea of what they can expect in themselves, what to do in those eventualities, and what to expect when the police arrive at your location. I think it's an excellent resource, and I think every business should show their employees.
I think there's a couple things, and one is more of the situation and the other is more of the aftermath. In the situation itself, I think one of the most important things and things that kept me safe in this particular instance, or as safe as I could be, was one, staying calm and being very aware of what was going on in my surroundings, looking for the opportunity to communicate where I could, being able to communicate with the outside world, and as I said, communicate with that one employee. They were then able to call the police and describe me. So then that gave the police an opportunity to know who I was and that I was a Discovery employee. So if there is an opportunity to communicate, stay calm, stay focused on the situation, I think is really key. I think two is throughout the entire situation is continuously evaluating. And that's something that with a little bit of distance and reflection that I realized probably saved our lives, and the fact that we were able to evaluate the situation, we were able to see what was going on, see his erratic behavior changing, and make a run when we thought it was best, not necessarily always waiting for law enforcement to make the best decision. And I think, unfortunately, I wouldn't always recommend that. I think it's a case-by-case evaluation, but in order to make that decision, you have to be extremely aware of what's going on. And not be disillusioned or allow yourself to break down in the situation.
If you do evacuate, it's important to understand what to expect from law enforcement and what they will expect from you.
Our primary mission is to go after the threat. We're not going to administer first aid. We're not going to stop bleeding. We're not going to control bleeding. We're simply going to bypass, and we will advise on the radio what we have as we go along to advise a rescue task force where the victims are. The command post should be documenting this as we're coming through so that they'll be aware of where these victims are so they can get to them as quickly as possible. You have the smells of gunpowder, burnt gunpowder in the air. You have people screaming at you as you're trying to clear through, quickly assessing whether or not they're armed or not. So all we're looking for is we're looking at hands and pushing through, giving the best advice as we're going through. Don't expect them to help you, don't expect them to give you direction. If they can, they will. If you have a great place to hide, stick with it. When they will eventually clear the entire premises and take you out eventually in a controlled manner.
Make sure you have your hands up. Expect to have guns pointed at you. You may be told to lie on the floor for your protection and for theirs. Most importantly, remember to follow the instructions of law enforcement officers.
Even though I was a hostage and that was clear, or what I thought was clear, you know, when I came around that post, I think it was very alarming to see that there are guns pointed at you and you're being demanded to stay on the ground, and just understanding that that's just procedure, it definitely scared me half to death in seeing that, but I realized that that is an important step in what's going on.
Chris's greatest regret was that he was looking at his phone and not looking where he was going when he went into the lobby. Had there been an effective notification system, he likely would never have become a hostage in that incident. Immediate notification is one of the most important mitigation measures. A number of organizations are moving to a mass notification online system because it provides notification across a number of platforms simultaneously. The other primary benefit is that these notification systems are available from outside the building. From either a tablet or smartphone, you can access these systems to provide not only immediate communication, but continuing communication during the event. Many facility managers indicate that having a social media presence has been very effective in not only establishing the ability to immediately communicate and provide notifications, but it also provides a two-way platform, providing information from those that are trapped inside the building reporting where they are, and also those that have been able to get outside the building, that they are safely away from the incident. Having mass notification systems are very effective. They allow you to reach your employees or your students directly with information. Accessing social media platforms also allows your message to get outside your organization to those that may be affected by the incident. Assisting others is also an important part of the immediate response. You need to help those that may need assistance in getting out, either due to mobility issues or they may need supervision. One of the worst things someone can do is to freeze. If you see someone who is in that mode, take immediate action to assist them to safety.
The resources in the body, from a physiologic standpoint, are funneled to physical survival at the cost of making good decisions. In terms of acute stressors, part of that fight or flight response is a discharge of a class of hormones called catecholamines. They make you stronger, they make you faster, they bias your thinking toward intuitive, which again we indicated might not be so good. It deadens pain, increases endurance. All of those things are geared to physical survival, and those are good things. But they come at a cost. Now our threats are far less physical, they're psychological. And the wisdom of the body is at the sacrifice of the brain. So that fight or flight response now is working against us from the cognitive standpoint.
Most people in modern industrial society, the first response to hearing a gunshot in an uncommon environment where it's unexpected is to tell themselves, that couldn't be a gunshot.
If you're unprepared for a gunshot, the mismatch part of the brain gets kicked in, and you're going to be confused, at best, paralyzed, which now makes you vulnerable to everything. You do not know what to do to protect yourself. That is the worst of all situations.
A lot of the confusion comes from not training. You don't have time to think. You don't have time to observe, orient, decide what you're going to do, and then act. It was all reflexive. It was all training based. If I had to think about it, I probably wouldn't be here today. It was a reflexive action that occurs through repetition and training and consistency in training, which makes a big difference.
So, in a high-risk environment where you think stressor X might occur, what you need to do is prepare.
People that have trained and practiced will perform better in a real incident. They may not perform perfectly, but they always perform better than people who've never practiced it. And part of it's that psychological inertia, just knowing that you have something that you're capable of doing in response to that stimulus can be super valuable.
Prepare people in terms of what gunshot sounds like. How is it different than a backfire on a car? And we would rehearse so that when they heard a gunshot, they would have a prescribed set of behaviors that are geared toward their survival. And it would kick in second nature.
And I think it really is, in my case, a reaction and not an action. Not a thoughtful action, it's just a reaction. And maybe training does change that.
We have, in the state of crisis, for lack of a better word, a cognitive dumbing down. We cannot access the higher intellectual resources that we normally do. And this is common knowledge. People would say, I was stressed out, I couldn't remember my phone number. I was stressed out, the police officer asked for my address, I couldn't give it to them. It comes back in a matter of moments when the stress level drops. But what do you do in that moment? Especially if what you do in that moment is the difference between life and death.
All of your training comes to one 5-second snapshot of your life comes into play at that point. And this is why it's important for civilians to train the run, hide, and fight. Because when it happens, you're going to get confused and you're not going to really necessarily know what to do. It's going to take you some time to decide. If you know how to train, if you're able to train and exercise your training, it's going to go a long way if this ever happens.
Are your employees trained to provide immediate first aid care? Many organizations are implementing the national Stop the Bleed program, which provides training and equipment for immediate trauma care. 2 items that an organization should have on hand are the more robust first aid kit and a go bag. Some examples of items that would go into a first aid kit would include a tourniquet, trauma dressings, occlusive bandages. The concept of a go bag is for the individual designated as a liaison to law enforcement to immediately have the materials necessary to assist the responders in gaining access to and navigating your building. Items that would go in the go bag would include things such as maps of your campus or individual buildings. It may have things such as pass cards or keys to every door within the facility. Some organizations are providing the web address and passwords to gain access to the security systems and to the video cameras. You need to meet with your local law enforcement agency prior to an incident to discuss what should be in that go bag. Anything that would assist law enforcement in getting through your facility. Some organizations are providing things such as door chocks and door markers, so as law enforcement progresses through the building, they are able to secure doors and to mark those that have been searched. Lieutenant Baker talks about how the collaboration prior to the incident at the Columbia Mall helped the responders during the incident.
When we arrived, it was just like we had trained, and we had trained numerous times in the Columbia Mall. They gave us time after hours, 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, to train, do simunition training inside there. We would set up scenarios that incorporated the fire department and mass casualty situations. All of that was done for years prior to this event happening. We knew that this was the centerpiece of our community. It was a high-profile target, very low security there, so it was a very easy target to be exploited by someone who had ill intent. We reached out to them, and we were able to train, not only train in there, but we were able to color code the actual floors of the mall. We were able to label entrances and exits for police to enter. They let us mark those entrances so our officers could find them readily and easily. Our dispatch center began dispatching calls inside the mall based on that color coding. So we knew that mall inside and out. We knew where the back passageways were. We knew where the how to get in behind the businesses. We knew all the tricky little areas in the underground area that we had to be able to access and clear in order to call the building safe. Without that preparation, without the ability to get inside there and train, it wouldn't have gone nearly as smoothly as it did that day.
When you call 911, the dispatcher will walk you through the information that's necessary. The most important information is where the event is occurring. The second most important information is what is occurring. The dispatchers are trained professionals who will walk you through the information they need. If you have information on the location of the shooter or shooters, if you have a description of the shooter or weapons or number of injured, all of that is important information. One of the most important pieces of information is exactly where the shooter is currently, so that can be relayed immediately to law enforcement.
911 is an amazing asset and works really well, but it doesn't work without components that people don't always see or understand when they call in. So frequently the person who calls 911, that call is routed through the phone equipment to a primary answering point called a public safety answering point, or PSAP. And they can connect police from several different jurisdictions, fire departments even, and ambulance services by routing the call to the proper dispatch center for the resource. So when you call in, the person who answers the phone will frequently say police, fire, or medical emergency. And people need to be prepared. They believe when they call 911 sometimes that they're getting the agency they intend to get, when in fact they're getting what amounts to a switchboard for that agency.
If you're sheltered in place and not sure that the knock on the door is from law enforcement, you can always call 911 to confirm the person on the other side of that door is in fact law enforcement. In the case of the Washington Navy Yard, there were reports of multiple shooters. Responders entered the scene not knowing what they'd be dealing with. We talked to some of them.
On September 16th, 2013, I was assigned to Metropolitan Police Department's emergency response team. I went to the gym to go for a run. I get a page on my pager that read, "Barricaded subject at the Navy Yard." So I get dressed, jump in the car, driving across the South Capitol Street Bridge. I have 2 other SWAT units in tow with me.
I remember thinking, this is real. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is what all the training has been for.
When they responded to the shots fired at Building 197, which is the NAVC building on the Navy Yard, they went into a base lockdown. Well, that base lockdown prevented additional resources to be able to get in.
I assembled the contact team. As we were responding towards the building, which we didn't really know the layout of the organization, or of the campus, we wound up, a lot of officers that were using cover started pointing the building out to us as we were making our approach.
You know, in 26 years of the police department, I've seen a lot of people that have been shot, but there was just a puddle of blood there. It was more blood than I've ever seen, ever, and since being on the police department. And that was where the security guard for the Navy Yard had been shot.
Once we got into the stairwell, there were multiple officers locking down different parts of the building. As we were ascending up to the 3rd floor, we were told that they were shooting up on the 3rd floor.
We started encountering a lot of civilians on the 3rd floor. And we ran into civilians on the stairwell. We saw movement back in behind the doors, and we just didn't know friend and foe, for one. And so you let someone out of a room, but how do you know someone just didn't mesh in with somebody else and they still have a gun behind you?
We started to push into this very large building. The building was approximately 760,000 square feet, so it was a pretty substantial sized building.
Navy Yard was huge. It was massive.
As we're going down the hallway, we encountered one victim. He had a single gunshot wound to the back.
I was very angry at that point, because all I kept thinking is this guy just showed up for work and he got killed for no reason. So we had to step over him and continue to where we thought the gunshots came from.
A couple of the doors suddenly opened and people started coming out when they heard us coming down. One room particularly opened up. A female, somewhat panicked, opened the door. I was point man as we were progressing down the hallway, and I met her with the muzzle of my weapon because the door flew open so suddenly. 2 of my guys escorted her out. We moved forward, and I ran into a park officer who said that one of our officers was just shot in an adjacent room.
I heard the gunshot, the first one, and I saw the stuff. I saw it hit my leg, my left leg, and then I felt it hit my right leg and break it and drop me to the floor. I fell, my gun fell out of my hand, and I had to make a terrible choice to try and reach it or to try and get behind cover because I didn't know where the guy was coming from.
So Officer Wong had said to me that we just pulled your canine officer out of this room. He was shot in the leg. We extracted him out. Just got into a firefight in this other room. And so I used Andrew Wong as a rear security and also as a blocking force in case the suspect came out of the other door. Because when I looked into that room, I didn't realize how large it was, but the actual two ends of the door that were 50 to 75 yards away were actually interconnected. I fortunately had the opportunity to had trained in this environment before. We had learned how to clear cube farms, and this is where your training, you always revert back to your training, so it really helped out. So as we started going forward, we started noticing pieces of Scott Williams. Scott Williams is the officer that was shot. He was shot through his left leg. As they were extracting him out, he started dropping his gear. He dropped his gun, he dropped his car keys, and they pulled his vest off. Even though Scott was kind of small in stature, the weight with the plates and all the ammo in his tack vest, they wound up pulling it off of him. So it created basically a trail for us to follow.
Our comms were just out the door. Like we had no radio comms at all, and so we're trying to figure out how we're going to get, one, there's a downed officer coming down the stairs. You know, two, we possibly were at a location where the shooter might be. I mean, I know the handoff between us and the last team, like that definitely could have been better. Like we could have gone over a little bit more stuff. Hey, where's the shooter? But it was extremely quick. You know, and of course, you know, they're trying to get a downed officer out of the building. You know, seconds count.
As I pied out as much as I could in that area of cubes, I didn't see a suspect, but I had a deep corner that I had to clear. So I went for the deep corner, and as I was rounding the corner, about 2 desks back, the suspect pops up and charges me.
The shots came through the wall, and I just kind of remember the drywall kind of exploding out the side of the into the hallway there.
One of the rounds struck me center chest. I returned fire and neutralized the threat. After I went forward, I cleared out the cube. We got close to a window. We were able to communicate that we had the suspect down. Still, we didn't have any comms, which was a little bit of a problem. We cleared the rest of that hallway. In that room where everybody was frantic, there were 4 males and 1 female. We pulled them out. We provided them an escort to a warm zone where there were officers. We got them out of the area. We tried to secure the crime scene the best we could. And eventually we were able to establish communications base back to command and advise them the situation.
The Washington Navy Yard incident is an example of a case where law enforcement did not have full access to all areas of the facility. Because of this, they had to breach many doors, causing thousands of dollars in damage. Additionally, this was a 500,000 square foot labyrinth, which was very difficult for them to navigate. The inability to shut off the fire alarm system and to access the security camera system caused significant delay in the response. It took officers hours to clear the large Navy Yard facility. The media was gathering information from any sources they could. This included interviewing those officers who worked at the Navy Yard but who were not authorized to speak on behalf of the Navy. It's important that your organization have someone who is designated, approved, and trained to provide this information to the public and to the media. There are so many venues now where your organization can directly speak to the public. If you have someone who is authorized to speak for your organization, who has access to things such as websites and social media accounts, you can immediately provide updates to the public and to the media. The role of the media is to provide information to those indirectly affected by the incident. It's important that you have the ability to provide immediate and accurate information to the public and to the media. This helps begin the healing process. In addition to providing information to the media, you also need to be able to provide information to the families of those affected, providing information as to where they will go for reunification. Finally, having the ability to insulate your students or your employees from the media can assist in the recovery process and prevent them from any further trauma.
I was at home and I actually got a phone call from a friend asking me what I had heard. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Gabby's been shot." This was ahead of the news outlets getting a hold of it. quickly started making some phone calls, got something up on my blog as quickly as possible, the Tucson Weekly blog as quickly as possible, saying that we'd heard that the Congresswoman had been shot, details to follow. And from there, it was just a blur of a day.
I was shocked that it turned out to be as big an event as it did. Here again, as a civilian, I'm not thinking federal agents are involved. This is a big deal. A federal judge was shot and killed. Gabby Giffords had an assassination attempt. So as civilians, we don't think about those kind of things. So it was shocking to have 60 reporters in my front yard 24 hours after that shooting.
My mom was transported to the hospital, and my brother and I went to our family friend's house, and we put on the news because I was waiting for it to be reported on. And it felt like we waited hours for anyone to start reporting on it, and then they started reporting all of this false information. The media invasion was really, I think it was trauma on top of the trauma, really, like trying to sensationalize an event.
Big one was, of course, that Gabby had been killed, and that story was actually put out by PBS and then retracted. There were rumors that the shooter was walking along, naming his victims as he shot them, members of the congressional staff. That was unfounded. The shooter, I don't think, knew very much about who he was shooting at. The numbers of people who were shot and the number of people who had been killed and stuff along those lines.
People want information to help calm their fears. And so the role of journalists in breaking news is to provide enough detail and perspective to know that something is contained, that something is understood, to understand the harm that has existed, so that in some ways it helps society begin that healing process.
We were there to tell the story of how the community came together, and the local press was here, long after the national press parachuted in to tell the larger elements of the story and the president's visit and things of that nature. But it was really the community itself that came together, and as journalists, we told the stories of the people who were killed that day. We told the stories of the people who were injured. We were there to talk about how we came together as a community after that.
For a reporter, the sensitivity is to think, this is someone's mother, this is someone's child. Am I being sensitive to their family if they're reading or picking this up? And do I really need to use their name? Do I really need to be so descriptive in the details of how they died? Isn't that painful? Is it essential for the reader or the viewer to have that at this instance? So in breaking news, it's sensitivity to the victims and sensitivity to the feelings of the community that I think are paramount for reporters to keep in their mind.
I think it's important for people who are a part of those kind of things to be able to say enough.
If you choose to talk, you can answer the questions you want to. You can be in the locations you choose. You can be with whomever you want. And don't let the media control your healing process. That is yours.
In the initial aftermath, it's really important to get a bubble around those people, to be able, not to suffocate them, not to close them out from the world, but to make sure they're protected and they're not bombarded by media, that they're not bombarded by people trying to reach out to them. I think that's the other important thing that in this situation Discovery did. Within the first 2 weeks, we were allowed to speak with media as we wanted to. We were allowed to voice our accounts of it, which I think was really important part of the healing process. We told our story.
Sensitivity, I believe, is the most important attribute that a good journalist brings to the game. People want to share their stories. It helps people to talk about what happened to them. If we give them that ability to share their stories without being rude in the process of welcoming their stories, then it helps community understand, and it helps people hear, and then I think we've done our duty.
It's important to understand that the recovery process is different for every individual. There's two important elements to recovery. Short-term, which takes care of the immediate needs of your individuals, getting them to a location where they can be safe, have access to communications, be out of the heat or the cold, have access to immediate psychological first aid, the ability to be interviewed by law enforcement, and to have reunification with families. Longer-term recovery incorporates a large range of other issues. Long-term mental health support, things such as workman's compensation issues, getting your organization back on its feet. There are so many issues that need to be planned for proactively rather than trying to figure these out when an incident occurs.
I think the most important thing when you're dealing with individuals in that situation is that it impacts everybody differently. In this situation, you had a security guard who was former military. You had, and then 2 employees who had no formal training, and so we all reacted to it differently. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, is that everybody responds differently to it. PTSD can impact individuals in very, very different ways. And some people need to go back to work sooner, some people need a little bit more time. It can trigger some things for people that the employer may not necessarily realize.
And if we've learned nothing about trauma, we've learned that it manifests itself in different ways and over different periods of time for different people. And in fact, many people won't really show those difficulties in responding to a situation and recovering from it and surviving it until months or even years after.
So what happens in the acute aftermath is critical.
The mistake that I made when I went back to college right after the shooting was that I was going to jump back into being the same girl I was before, the same type of person, the same social activities, same kind of friends. And when things snuck in, when I would find myself afraid of being in small rooms or claustrophobic or scared in classrooms, I try to push those away and reject them. And about 8 months after the shooting, I had basically a post-traumatic stress breakdown.
That's when your crisis support is most needed. Because the brain will have the tendency to go over and over and over in a very obsessive pattern until it can solve the problem. The issue is sometimes the problem can't be solved. So the person is going to be reliving the event over and over and over again, not as a form of pathology per se, it's trying to solve the problem. We also have a tendency to take responsibility for things over which we have no control. Now, when you put those two things together, that can be rather toxic.
Just bawling on the floor, nothing really triggered me, and then having to go and research PTSD and all of that, owning that event. And so saying it's okay changed you, how do we make that less painful? And so I sat in therapy for about 2 years.
I took a little bit more time than others. I reevaluated some things in life, but I eventually went back to the corporation. Although it was in a different location, it was on the West Coast, it did allow me to continue to work there for 2 more years. While I continued to heal and figure things out, and I think that that's important as well.
The body has a memory, and it's going to react a certain way, and it's not always voluntary.
So how we respond in that acute phase after a critical incident is imperative. It will literally shape how the brain works.
99.9% of my PTSD is gone. My PTSD is loud and sudden noises, and it doesn't have to be a gun. A sudden and loud noise will take me back to that day.
For me, what really helped was the community in my school was really supportive, and then our just extended friends from Tucson, friends of friends, who came over and made sure we weren't alone, made sure we had food, all of that kind of stuff.
We have formed a very strong tribe of survivors.
One of the other fortunate things about the Tucson shooting is that we were all there, we all were there to talk to Gabby. She's our congresswoman. We have that in common. We're all from this part of town. None of us knew each other except her staffers. And we, for the most part, there are few people that don't want to be part of the survivors group, but I gained comfort and strength from being with them. There's some sort of bond that only people that were there share.
I have always called them my second family. So most people, you don't get to pick your first family, but most people get to pick their second family. I didn't get to pick my second family either.
The mutual encouragement is very beneficial. You know, what we say to each other, it's not trite, it's not canned, it's very heartfelt.
I think it's a journey, unfortunately, that one I didn't necessarily want to embark on, but one that you're forced into, and then you embrace it, and you find a new conversation, a new way of thinking about it that's more positive and empowering. If the story ended at, I was the girl who got shot at Virginia Tech, that's not a very empowering story 5 years after. But to be able to say that I found hopefully some positive out of this experience, and then that helped change the way that a teacher or a student or anyone thinks about their safety or their school or whatever it may be, then that's hopefully using the memory of those that we lost in a positive way. I think the worst thing we can do is to forget about, all the different shootings and the individuals, because that's when we'll allow it as a society to happen again.
So part of your plan needs to be, what resources are you providing, and where will you have access to those during an emergency? Can you offer paid leave? Can you cover the medical expenses? Do you have insurance that would cover this? Have you checked with your insurance carrier? Another consideration is the recovery process for your organization as a whole and for that specific facility. Will patrons avoid your facility? Will employees who are not even affected directly by the event be afraid to come to work? How you can manage the recovery process will in part affect the rebranding of your organization. In the wake of an attack, you may be prevented from accessing your facilities for days or even potentially weeks. How will you continue the key and critical operations of your organization during this period of time? Some examples you might consider are, how will you have access to your IT systems and communication systems? Can many of your employees now work remotely to continue their operations? All of this is part of your recovery plan and part of your continuity of operations plan. If you have a continuity plan, examine that from the standpoint of an active shooter incident to see where you can make improvements to your existing plan.
Now we've learned about the team and procedures responsible for mitigating active shooter risks. We know now what to do in response to an active shooter, either individually or to aid law enforcement. We know the resources we should provide to aid people in harm's way, how to communicate with the media and with loved ones, and how to ensure continuity of operations for your business. Finally, we must synthesize this information so that you can begin drafting your own tailored emergency response plan. And we begin by asking the important question, now what?
What we've talked about today is developing a plan for your organization, developing your planning team, looking at mitigation strategies, immediate response capabilities, and the ability to recover from such an event. Now begins the hardest part, taking the first step, identifying who in your organization needs to be on this robust planning team, getting the buy-in from senior leadership to begin the process, conducting that risk assessment, identifying goals and objectives and building those out into courses of action, drafting the plan. The hardest obstacle to overcome is getting senior level buy-in. The other issue is, how do you provide training to your employees to instill confidence rather than anxiety? The possibility of an active shooter incident is frightening. However, as Dr. George Everly indicates, the training process can turn that fear into positive action.
We need to take anxiety, turn it into fear, and then manage it, which sounds a little ridiculous. But anxiety is the mismatch between expectations and reality. Very hard to control. Even pharmacologically, different drugs are used to control anxiety versus fear. Fear we we know how to manage. So the take-home message for organizations is, from the neuroscience point of view, is about the worst thing that sends a ripple effect, a shock through your workforce, is something happening outside the realm of expectations, something that, especially in retrospect, employees will say, we should have prepared for that. That undermines their faith in the organization and undermines their faith in management. One of the things that we find that also seems to help develop that psychological body armor, not just from the individual point of view, but from the organizational and group point of view, is group cohesion and the organizational climate. If the organization is cohesive, it serves as a form of organizational body armor and trickles down to the individual as well. We've known this for decades.
Part of that is building your community and driving that collaboration. It's important that you understand your risk picture so that you can identify the capabilities that are necessary to protect your facility and understand how to do this without violating anyone's privacy. Under HIPAA, which addresses health privacy issues, and under FERPA, which talks about educational family rights and privacy, if you believe that an individual may be a threat to themselves or others, you have the right to report that to law enforcement. Once you've developed your plan, you need to think about how you will train your stakeholders to implement the plan. How do you ensure that people are aware of that process? Do you know what training will need to be provided to each individual? Do you know how that training will be provided and how you will document that that training has been conducted? And are you ensuring that your plan is equally accessible to those with disabilities or access and functional needs? What type of exercises are effective in training and evaluating your plan? Conducting drills, notification drills, evacuation and personal protective drills are a good starting point. Ultimately, you may choose to get to a full-scale exercise where you plan this exercise with local responders to look at how they would coordinate with you in response to an incident occurring at your facility. And you're not alone. Law enforcement will appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with your organization.
Reach out to your teams, okay? Reach out to your SWAT commanders and ask them if they'd be willing to do a tour of your location. Ask them if, listen, offer training time. There's one thing SWAT teams are always looking for. It's a location to train. We're tired of running through the same abandoned buildings over and over and over again. If we have your building, if an event does occur there, after we've trained there, we're familiar with it. We're familiar with the nuances of your layout and of your building. And it's really key to success. Don't be afraid to contact your local police department at their headquarters or wherever it is and give them that opportunity. Reach out to them and say, listen, I have this many employees, I have this business. I would really like you to come in. If you can't do a presentation for us on what you would expect in an active shooting situation, at least come through and tour our building and take a look and see what we have here. Because there are a lot of things that go into that. Hazardous materials you have on site, gas lines that you have in the building, the types of doors that you have, all things that the team will want to look at and want to see so they can prepare to make entry or to respond to an incident at your business.
Law enforcement is just one example of the outside agencies that may be helpful in developing and reviewing your plan. Also, talk to the emergency managers within your community. Talk to the other responding organizations, mental health agencies, so you know you will get the resources that you need during an emergency. These different perspectives from within the community can help you make sure that you're meeting legal guidelines, compliance standards, and assuring that your plan is comprehensive. As you continue to examine and evaluate your organization, there are some questions that you need to ask yourself. Does this plan account for everyone who may be within your facility? Those with disabilities or access and functional needs? Those that may be contractors or volunteers or customers, or anyone who may be within your facility? Does this plan also help us to address other threats, such as natural disasters, workplace violence, or insider threats? This could be anything from an earthquake to an IT breach. Ask yourself how you can use these planning principles and protective actions in your own life. The final thing we'll talk about before we leave you are other resources that will be available to assist you. One example is the Federal Protective Service Occupant Emergency Plan. A very good example of a plan structure and format that you may wish to follow. You can take classes with law enforcement. Address yourself of the many active shooter workshops and trainings that are available. Also, you can check govevents.com to see if the Department of Homeland Security is sponsoring any active shooter preparedness workshops.
And finally, continue to explore the DHS Active Shooter Preparedness website, which has additional resources that will assist you in your planning process.
We've given you information and resources to develop a plan. This process of collaboration and communication will make your organization stronger. And if the worst case scenario should occur, we'll save lives.